In a small, quiet town, life moved at an unhurried pace. Steve, a chubby ginger cat with brown eyes, was almost a symbol of this tranquil rhythm. His favorite spot was on the windowsill of a large window overlooking the garden, where in spring the air smelled of lilacs, and in autumn leaves danced in the wind. Steve enjoyed this daily monotony. His father, Ted, was the opposite. Almost every day, he shared stories from his past. Ted was a cat full of pride and dignity, and his tales sounded like legends. Steve, although he appeared to pay no attention, often dreamed of trying such a life, but not too much and not for too long. That evening, Ted was reminiscing about his younger days spent in backyards, where every tree was a challenge and every opponent was a potential ally or foe.
Steve, what would you say about your life?
Ted asked, giving his son a searching look.
It's perfect just as it is.
Steve replied, purring lazily. Just then, the door burst open and Sarah entered the house. She held plane tickets in her hands, her face radiant with excitement.
Steve, Ted, I have big plans. I'm flying to Japan for a few days. You two will stay here, but I promise I'll be back quickly.
Steve looked at her with a mix of curiosity and unease.
Japan? What kind of place was that?
Chapter 1: The Tempting Sweater. In the days that followed, Sarah enthusiastically prepared for her trip. All around Steve, suitcases, clothes, and various knickknacks were piling up as Sarah meticulously chose her items. Steve couldn't stop watching his owner. Naturally curious, but also slightly suspicious, he sensed that something was approaching that would disrupt his calm rhythm. However, his thoughts were constantly distracted by a particular sweater, cashmere, soft, and scented with home. Steve began an internal struggle. He knew that traveling with Sarah meant chaos and uncertainty. Yet something was pulling him toward that suitcase. When Sarah left the room for a moment, he couldn't hold back any longer. He jumped onto the bed, curled up on the sweater, and allowed himself a short nap. He didn't notice when the suitcase was closed. Soon, he found himself in a taxi and then at the airport. Chapter 2: The Unexpected Passenger. The journey was surprisingly long and tiring for Steve. The hustle and bustle of the airport, the sounds of flight announcements, and the constant jostling of the suitcase made him feel uneasy. But as the trip went on, curiosity began to replace his anxiety. When Sarah opened the suitcase in her Tokyo hotel room, the look on her face was priceless.
Steve, what are you doing here?
She exclaimed, clutching her head. Steve, feigning innocence, stretched out his paws and yawned widely. Sarah, though stunned, eventually gave up trying to understand how her cat had ended up in Japan.
Fine,
She said.
but stay here. I don't want you getting into trouble.
Steve, of course, had other plans. Chapter 3: First Steps in Tokyo. As soon as Sarah fell asleep after the long journey, Steve slipped out onto the balcony. The cityscape took his breath away. Towering buildings, flashing neon lights, the smell of street food, and bustling crowds. He hesitated for only a moment before leaping onto a nearby awning. His heart pounded wildly, but his curiosity was stronger. On Tokyo's streets, he faced his first challenge. He met Akio, a cat whose eyes gleamed like two black stones.
You're a lost tourist, aren't you?
Akio asked with a hint of irony.
And what if I am?
Steve replied, trying to sound confident. Akio smirked and offered to show him the city. Chapter 4: Meeting the Cats of Asakusa. Under the cover of night, Akio took Steve to the Asakusa district. It was a place steeped in history and mystery. Narrow alleys, old wooden buildings, and the Sensoji temple felt like another world. In the temple gardens, they met Sakura, a cat with extraordinarily long white fur, considered the guardian of the place.
Do you believe in spirits?
She asked, looking at Steve intently. Steve, unsure how to respond, quickly discovered that each of Sakura's stories carried a deeper meaning. She spoke of cats that had helped monks over the centuries, protected the temple, and were symbols of wisdom. Chapter 5: Friendship with Taro. The next day, Steve decided to explore Ueno Park. It was a place full of greenery, tranquility, and scents that made his head spin. There, he met Taro, a Shiba Inu dog, running among the trees.
I've never seen a cat in the park before.
Taro exclaimed, wagging his tail. Taro was incredibly friendly and immediately offered to show Steve around. Together, they ran along the paths, visited Shinabazu Pond, and Taro shared stories of ancient samurai who had once walked the same trails. Chapter 6. The Encounter with the Crane. The evening, Taro took Steve to the Zen garden, where they met Kenji, a wise old crane who had lived there for many years.
A cat from a distant land?
Kenji asked, tilting his head.
In your eyes, I see questions you haven't yet asked. Pausing to appreciate the beauty around us is fundamental, both in daily life and in deeper reflections about our place in the world. Such moments allow us to find harmony, see things from a new perspective, and notice what often slips by in the hustle of everyday life.
Kenji spoke calmly, his words flowing like ancient poetry. The crane taught Steve the importance of pausing and appreciating the surrounding beauty, finding magic in seemingly ordinary things, for it is these things that give life its depth. Chapter 7. A New Mystery in the Suitcase. Steve, exhausted, curled up in a soft sweater inside the suitcase. This time, however, he didn't feel as calm as before. Questions swirled in his mind. What next? Was this the end of his adventures? In the middle of his nap, he heard a faint whisper.
Steve? Steve?
He opened his eyes and looked around. Was it his imagination, or could there be something more hidden in the suitcase? After a moment, he noticed a small, shiny object. It was an old coin that Sarah must have accidentally taken from the market in Asakusa. The coin seemed to pulse as if it had its own energy.
Maybe it's some kind of Japanese spell?
He muttered to himself.
I must be imagining things. I'm tired.
He didn't have time to think it over because the suitcase began to gently tremble, as if it were enchanted. Steve concluded that it was just a hallucination caused by fatigue, so he lay down to sleep since Sarah had an early morning flight home. Chapter 8. The Mysterious Call. When Sarah opened the suitcase at home, the coin unexpectedly rolled onto the floor. Steve immediately leaped out and stared at the object with curiosity, but also unease.
Where did this come from?
Sarah wondered, picking up the coin. On it was engraved the image of a cat, resembling the Maneki Neko figurines, or lucky cats. Steve felt a strange warmth spread through his paws, as though the coin was somehow connected to him. Ted, lounging in his favorite chair, glanced at his son with interest.
That's no ordinary coin,
Ted said solemnly, examining it closely. Steve sighed, not taking it too seriously. Chapter 9. Return to Japan. Through a portal. At night, while everyone slept, the coin began to glow with a golden light. Steve awoke suddenly, feeling an irresistible pull toward the object. As he approached the coin, the light grew so intense that he had to shut his eyes. When he opened them, he was no longer at home. He stood on the cobblestones of an ancient street, surrounded by red lanterns and wooden buildings. The air was fragrant with incense and freshly baked rice bread.
Where am I?
He murmured nervously.
This must be a dream.
From the shadows, a familiar figure emerged,
Welcome back, Steve.
said Sakura, the cat from Asakusa.
It seems the coin has drawn you here. This time your journey will be even more extraordinary.
Chapter 10. The Village of Spirits. Sakura took Steve to a village high in the mountains, where cats were revered as spiritual guardians. The residents of this village, both humans and animals, believed that cats could predict the future and bring good fortune. Steve was greeted with great joy. Children approached him to stroke his soft fur, and the elder villagers bowed to him, seeing him as a symbol of prosperity. In the village, he met a cat named Hana, who shared stories of ancient spirits said to dwell in the surrounding forests.
Spirits can be our friends, but if you anger them, they can ensure you lose your way forever.
Hana warned, gazing at Steve with a serious expression. Steve, initially skeptical, would soon have the chance to discover that the legends of this village were far more than mere tales. Chapter 11. The Challenge of the Bamboo Forest. One of the traditions in the Village of Spirits was passing through the bamboo forest to obtain the Stone of Wisdom, a talisman believed to bring peace and inner balance. Encouraged by the villagers, Steve decided to try his luck. The forest was dense, and moonlight barely pierced through the tall, swaying bamboo stalks. In the heart of the forest, he heard a strange whisper.
Steve, be brave.
At first, he thought it was his imagination, but soon he noticed a small, glowing orb floating in the air. It was a fox spirit, guiding him to a clearing where the Stone of Wisdom lay.
You found the path because your heart is pure,
said the spirit. Steve felt a strange strength and peace within himself, something he had never experienced before. Chapter 12. Return to the city and a surprise. Upon returning to the city, Steve noticed that the coin had started glowing again. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Sakura, Hana, and even the fox spirit Taro decided to accompany him. They arrived at an old temple where a mysterious statue of a large cat with golden eyes awaited them.
Steve, your heart and courage have drawn us all together,
said the fox spirit.
This journey is not the end, but only the beginning of your destiny.
The cat statue began to glow, and Steve felt himself being transported to another place. Chapter 13. The World of Cats in Another Reality. Steve awoke in a world designed entirely for cats. Houses, roads, and even trains were tailored to their needs. It was the kingdom of cats, where every feline could fulfill their dreams. Steve was welcomed by the queen of this realm, a cat named Midori, who invited him to a feast full of fish, soft cushions, and catnip.
You can stay here forever, Steve,
said the queen. But Steve began to miss home, Sarah, and Ted. He knew that although this world was beautiful, his place was elsewhere. Chapter 14. Returning Home. With the help of his friends and the magical coin, Steve found his way back. Sarah, who had no idea about his adventures, was happy to see her cat at home and not in the suitcase. Ted, hearing everything that had happened, looked at his son with pride.
Maybe you are lazy, Steve, but you do have the spirit of adventure,
he said, purring contentedly. Steve smiled to himself. He knew this wasn't his last adventure because, once again, adventure would find him. The coin lay on the windowsill, glimmering in the moonlight. Steve gazed at it with a mix of curiosity and resignation.
Maybe someday. Although I'm not sure it wasn't all just a dream. After the journey, I was so tired that it must have been a dream,
he murmured, falling asleep. Cattails reminds us how important it is to pause in the rush of everyday life to notice the beauty of the world around us. Whether in the rustling of leaves, the stunning landscapes of Japan, or the gaze of a newfound friend. Though Steve loves luxury, his journey teaches him to appreciate simplicity and the beauty of the moment. Gratitude for what we have brings inner peace and allows us to enjoy life on a deeper level.